Well, as we make our way into the book of Numbers this past week that you've been reading, what comes to mind when you think about the book of Numbers? Yeah? Gets its name given the fact that it starts with a census, an accounting of the tribes of Israel. The book of Numbers really breaks down into three main sections. You've got the preparation of Israel at Sinai. You've got their journeying from Sinai to the borders of Canaan. And then we see a final preparation in the plains of Moab to enter the Promised Land. And so it chronicles their 40 years of wandering in the desert. But there's many familiar stories, whether you recognize that they're in Numbers or not, you will over the next couple of weeks as you're reading. But as Jacob mentioned, the Nazirite vow, the priestly blessing of Aaron that you may not be able to recite, but you'll know it when you read it. I've heard this before. What's that weird ceremony of this discovery of infidelity in women in marriage? Spies sent in the Promised Land to scope out the land before them. With a heavy price paid when they came back. Moses striking the rock for water, and on we could go. But these are stories we're familiar with growing up in church, if you will. Was it a 40-year journey from Egypt to Canaan? They walked straight from Egypt to Canaan. Was it?
Crow flies.
Yeah. So why did it take them 40 years?
Their paths mimic the waywardness of their own souls.
Yeah, God
Nothing
condemned them
that back
for
and forth.
a year for every day what they were in. They were spying out the land of Canaan.
Yeah. So it was, we can read many things from it as we're going to do today, but it was a direct result of their lack of faith, lack of confidence in their God. He had delivered them from the bondage of Egypt, sent them in to scout out, but to see the beauty and the glory of the land that he had promised them. And instead of seeing the beauty and the glory and the promise, they got scared. And they came back and gave a bad report, said if we go into this land, we're going to get obliterated. And so it was punishment that this faithless generation really died out. God specifically said, you will not move forward until this entire generation dies out, including Moses and Aaron, for their own lack of faith. There were two people who made it, who left Egypt, but made it into the Promised Land. Who were those two? Joshua and Caleb, two of those spies, if you will. And so the book of Numbers really, we see a theme of submission and obedience to God and trust in His plan. These are central to the book. And we're going to look at a bit of that theme today in what I think is going to be a two-part lesson. We'll spend the next couple of weeks in the book of Numbers, see what we can learn from their journeying. We mentioned it here, but when Israel left Egypt, where was the first major place that they camped? They had a few other small encampments, but after they crossed the Red Sea, where did they end up? Where was the giving of the law? Mount Sinai. Not a trick question, just they spent a year at the base of Mount Sinai, right? At the giving of the law. What was given next? What were they to construct? Tabernacle, right. They camped there for a year to complete the tabernacle. Individuals were gifted with the skills, the wisdom, the ability. Offerings were given of the materials, and they spent the time building the tabernacle. And that's where we pick up. They've been there for a year. The tabernacle has just been completed. But as we're reading through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, we see their movement from Egypt to the base of Sinai in the beginning of Exodus. And then starting in Exodus 18:19, that movement is really interrupted all the way up until Numbers chapter 9. And in that interim period, we see the giving of the Sinaitic legislation or covenant, if you will. God's instructions for worship, for holiness, for purity, and many other things. And so now they're going to celebrate a Passover, and we're going to pick up in Numbers chapter 9. But as we said, this picks up from a passage in Exodus. So we're going to start there first. On the screen you'll see Exodus 40, verses 34 to 38. Somebody doesn't mind to read that off the screen, and then we're going to spend time in Numbers 9.
Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. In all the travels of the Israelites, whenever a cloud lifted from above the tabernacle, they would set out. But if the cloud did not lift, they did not set out until the day it lifted. So the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, and the fire was in the cloud by night, in the sight of all the Israelites during all their travels.
So God had gifted Bezalel and Aholiab with the skills, the wisdom, the ability to lead the design, the construction of the tabernacle. It's been completed, and we see those offerings and sacrifices brought before the tabernacle that Jacob mentioned earlier. So the tabernacle is consecrated, sacrifices are given, and we see the glory of the Lord descending upon it in a cloud so thick that Moses couldn't even enter. And so let's pick up in Numbers 9, 15 to 23. That's going to repeat but expand on this a little bit as well. Somebody wants to read that for us. I've got it on multiple slides. I'll track through as you're reading.
On the day of the tabernacle, the tent of the covenant law was set up. The cloud covered it. From evening till morning, the cloud above the tabernacle looked like fire. That is how it continued to be. The cloud covered it, and at night it looked like fire. Okay.
Keep going. We've got a few more here.
Whenever the cloud lifted from above the tents, the Israelites set out. Wherever the cloud settled, the Israelites encamped. At the Lord's command, the Israelites set out, and at his command they encamped. As long as the cloud stayed over the tabernacle, they remained in camp. When the cloud remained over the tabernacle a long time, the Israelites obeyed the Lord's order and did not set out.
Two more.
Sometimes the cloud was over the tabernacle only a few days. At the Lord's command, they would encamp, and then at his command they would set out. Sometimes the cloud stayed only from evening till morning, and when it lifted in the morning, they set out. Whether by day or by night, whenever the cloud lifted, they set out. Whether the cloud stayed over the tabernacle for 2 days, or a month, or a year, the Israelites would remain in camp and not set out, but when it lifted, they would set out. At the Lord's command, they encamped, and at the Lord's command, they set out. They obeyed the Lord's order in accordance with his command through Moses.
It's not the way we write, is it? There's a lot of repetition in there. We would say just get to the point and say it once and move on. But this is a linguistic style that we see many times throughout the Torah, if you will, in writings. Some believe that there was in the middle of this a bit of a chant or a song that Israel would sing as they began to ready for move out or to set up camp. But we see this picture of the tabernacle being consecrated and this cloud descending upon it. What is this cloud?
It's a heavy substance, no.
What's it represent? Again, not a trick question.
Glory.
Yeah. In Numbers 9, it simply speaks of a cloud. But the reason we read the Exodus passage is because the Exodus passage makes it clear that cloud is the glory of God. It is the presence of God. It's what we call a theophany. You might know what a theophany is?
Appearance of God
To a person.
Yeah. It's a physical manifestation of God. Why do we need theophanies to see God? Does God look like you and me?
Can't look upon his face and live. He's not biological. He's spirit.
Yeah, he's spirit. Theophanies are the only way that man knows to relate to God from a physical presence standpoint. Obviously, so much more we could dig into there, but the point is, this is an example of a theophany of God, his full presence, whatever that meant, what was present in this cloud that descended upon the tabernacle. God chose to make his presence known in a very particular way, because what do we know about God? Isn't he omnipresent? Isn't he everywhere? So what does it mean that his presence was concentrated here in this cloud that descended upon the tabernacle, just like it descended upon Sinai, right? We've seen that all throughout Exodus. He makes his presence known. Do you recall reading through Leviticus and Numbers what the setup of the camp was? Where was the tabernacle in relation to the camp?
In the middle.
God was very explicit in his instructions on how they were to set up camp. There were 3 tribes on all 4 sides, 12 in total, tabernacle in the middle. So where was God's presence? Central to the camp. The word used here is kavod, means glory. We see it used here in, skip one. See it used here in Exodus 24. When Moses went up to the mountain, the cloud covered it. The glory of the Lord settled upon Mount Sinai. For 6 days the cloud covered the mountain, and on the 7th day the Lord called to Moses from within the cloud. To the Israelites, the glory of the Lord looked like a consuming fire on top of the mountain. Can you think of other examples where we see this kavod of God represented in a cloud or fire? Burning bush. Yeah. We see it in Ezekiel's vision of the divine chariot. We see it again when the when the temple is constructed and the consecration of the temple. We also see it in the New Testament. Remember when disciples were looking at Jesus, Moses, and Elijah? During the transfiguration of Jesus, it said all of a sudden they were covered in a cloud. It was the glory of God, and God spoke and said, "This is my son." We also see it in his ascension. He ascended and was covered by a cloud. It means heavy or weighty. This word kavod means heavy or weighty. It's the same word we see, it's the same root word from the word meaning rich. How might that make sense? Heavy with riches. We have a word today, don't we? Loaded. Loaded down with riches. Again, not the same word, same root word here. But it means to be weighty or heavy. Why would the glory of the Lord be weighty or heavy?
Concentrated.
I think that anytime we encounter God in our lives, and I think whether we have these, what you would call a theophany, but I think we can all at times feel the burden of God's majesty and glory, and it does feel heavy to the soul. It's when you encounter God truly, there's a weight to that. And I think that's the only way we can describe it, but it's heavy to bear who God is and our relation to Him.
Mm-hmm.
Fearful in a way as you feel our reaction. Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things at that point too, the more concentrated God's presence is, the more unholy we feel, undeserving, because we know that by ourselves we are never on the same playing field, but because of Jesus we have access, but it's still heavy because we know that we're so unworthy of Jesus, like being that present at that time in our lives. So.
Absolutely. Anybody ever been to the 9/11 Museum in New York? If you have not been, I cannot recommend it highly enough. But we went this past year, I think, with the kids, and of course 9/11 happened well before any of our kids were born. But when you go to the museum, awesome in the full meaning of that word for so many reasons, but when you get to the very center of the museum, there is it's as deep as you can go in the foundation of the building. It's right in the middle. It's a little square room, not big. It's dark. It's, as you approach, you hear what is taking place in this room. And when you enter this room, it is a 24-hour-a-day wake. service for the more than 3,000 souls that were lost on that day. And 24 hours a day, it is a constant loop of reading their names, displaying their picture on the wall, and just a short snippet about each. And you feel it before you even get there. You know, when you're in public, never your kids, but other people's kids are just always acting up, right? When you get here, there's none of that. It doesn't matter whether people were there and remember where they were on that day, whether or not. It is something that you feel the presence of this room before you even get there. And when you get in, you won't find pictures online of it. It's not, nobody's that disrespectful. But it's a weight you can feel. And that we can relate to and we can feel and we can experience in no way can compare to what the weight of God's presence must have felt like. It's the full weight of His goodness, the full weight of His beauty, the full weight of His mercy, but also the full weight of His justice and His wrath. God's presence is, as Jacob said, both reassuring and fear-inspiring, awe-inspiring. Remember what He told Moses as he passed by to show him His presence. Not only did He pronounce His mercy, but He pronounced His willingness to punish and His justice. He is a just God. If He did not punish sin, He would not be a just God. So what's the significance of God dwelling now at the center of the camp? Where had His presence been while they camped at Sinai? On the mountain. And when His presence descended upon the mountain there, what instructions were given to the people? Was it, welcome, come on up? No, couldn't even step foot on the mountain. And I highly doubt people tested those limits. Couldn't step foot on the mountain. Only Moses could go up. They weren't even allowed to touch the base of the mountain or they would die. For what it's worth, this picture is awesome to think about the presence of God on that mountain, but this doesn't look a thing like the desert around Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai was not that tall. You can think AI-generated images for that, but I like pictures. But they spent a good year, presumably seeing the presence of God descending upon this mountain. Whether it was there all the time or whether it came and went, we could speculate upon. But even when it was not there, do you think people feared that mountain? I don't know about you guys, but knowing that His presence could descend at any moment and come back down, I'm not stepping foot anywhere near that mountain. And so now we see this presence that was separate, they're told don't come anywhere near, all of a sudden has come now and planted itself right in the center of their camp. His kavod, his glory came and rested at the center of their camp. So do you think when He said to move, they would pack up and move? I think we would. As we go to work our way through this passage that Allison read here, in a way repeated multiple times, what we're told is when God said to move, they moved. When they camped, they camped. And their signal was they were going to be led now by a pillar of cloud by day, a pillar of fire by night. When it picked up from the tabernacle and moved, they were to follow. And when it stopped, that's where the center of the tabernacle was to be set back up, and they were to encamp around it. So God tells them they're going to celebrate Passover again, and then they're going to begin to move. Where were they the last time they celebrated Passover? Yeah, that was the first celebration of Passover when they were with haste told to eat and prepare themselves to leave. And here we are again under the same circumstances. Their instructions have been given, prepare to leave. You're going to need a Passover again and be watching for the signal. And like any relationship, it starts out good, doesn't it? We don't see any indication here of dissension, of grumbling, of disobedience. When God says move, they're going to move. And He's not only leading, He's protecting. This cloud, I imagine, would have protected them from the hot sun in the desert, and a pillar of fire leading them and providing light by night with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. We see that repeated in the way that God brought them out of out of Egypt, and in the same way He's going to lead them to their promised land. Did things stay that way? Did they stay that faithful to the leading of God? Sadly, no. I think we can understand Him, but let's unpack it a little bit. There's a phrase here in verse 22 that stood out to me that I would imagine we struggle with when we really start to think about it. And that is here that it says that whether they were set up for 2 days or a month or a year. Anybody else struggle with that? We don't like uncertainty, do we? But think about what that means. They were to set up camp and be ever at the ready. I mean, how do you establish routine? They had no idea when or where it was going to lead them next, knowing that it could pick up at any moment. I have to imagine, as I certainly would, when I know Canaan is that way and the cloud starts moving that way, God, aren't we supposed to be going that way? Playing a little bit of backseat driver. And so I think we all understand, if we're honest, what Psalm 106 tells us. Psalm 106 chronicles the journeying of Israel. And in verse 13, we see exactly what happened here. But soon they forgot what He had done, and they did not wait for His plan to unfold. So I want to spend a little time here looking at the difficulty in the waiting. And next week we're going to look at the distraction in the moving. Looking at it the way Israel moved through the wilderness. But it says they did not wait for His plan. Do you remember some of the grumblings of Israel? Yeah.
Every time the certain food they had.
Food, bad water remember the waters of Meribah. Challenging of Moses' leadership by Korah and his followers and the judgment on them. Desire for meat like they had at Egypt. Were they typically on the move or encamped when these things occurred? They were typically encamped. When we wait, what do our minds do? Are you good at shutting off your mind and letting it encamp? We're biased toward action. When we're waiting, we're trying to figure out the next step. It's where we're more comfortable. And waiting is really a test of faith and patience, especially in long periods of encampment. So can we blame Israel for the way in which they began to display unfaithfulness? He had delivered them, He had given them the law, He had prepared them to move, He had organized the camp, and now He says, wait. Whether it's 2 days, a month, a year, there would have been varying time frames. But why do we find it so difficult in times of waiting?
Not sure of the future.
No? First of all, my waiting never looks like this. If it did, I could sit there quite a while. But, I mean, speaking personally, give me a verse like, study to show yourself approved, no problem. I can tackle that. I can make a plan, I can track my progress, no problem. Give me Psalm 46, be still and know that I am God. I fail.
Picture of Peter, isn't it? I go fishing.
Yeah. I do not know how to be still. Again, just speaking to me personally. Easy for me to say that I have a ton of responsibilities that keep me busy, but in reality, it's probably more self-fulfilling prophecy that because I don't know how to sit still, I fill my life with what I call responsibilities. So what ends up sounding, or I could tell myself sounds noble, really is a weakness. Amy's doing well too. not comment. But it's a lack of what?
Trust.
Oh man, hitting me. I was going to say patience, but yes.
Well, I just brought this up in my D group a few weeks ago. If you ask me right now, do I trust God? There's no hesitation. Yep, sure.
Yep.
But boy, do I have a problem showing that sometimes in the waiting part, right? Because I say, you talk out of both sides of your mouth, right? You say, God's always on time. But holy moly, I sure did want to answer that prayer yesterday, right? It's two things at once. I trust my God with all my heart and soul, but then I got this lack of trust problem because I want it right now and I can't.
Yep.
I can't be at camp, not even for a day,
Yep.
right? Because my mind wanders. And as soon as you said it, I thought, oh, I think he's talking about the guy who just got here. Like, it's so very true, and it's something that I struggle with, right? Is saying that I fervently trust my God to be on time, but I'm not gonna wait for it.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely. We'll come back to that.
We're so used to instant gratification
Yeah.
for everything that it's hard to,
Now I gotta go tell my kids
yeah.
who got their cell phones and iPads that they need to be patient.
Yeah. Well, this word patient, it's a word you've heard Heath preach on a few times. Hupomone. It means to remain up under or to stay put under. Also translated endurance or steadfastness. When we hear that word, depending on your translation, steadfastness, forbearance, where do we hear that in Scripture? Bearing what of the Spirit? Fruit. Yeah, fruit of the Spirit is patience, forbearance, endurance. It's manifested by the presence of God in us. Waiting, to your point, waiting doesn't necessarily mean sitting still and doing nothing, does it? When Israel was encamped, life went on. They had to gather food. They busied themselves. They conducted sacrifices and offerings, but they waited for God to move. Likewise, maybe our waiting is disguised by our busyness, but it involves our waiting to understand a particular circumstance in our life. Maybe there's a prayer that we've been praying that hasn't been answered. Maybe there's something that happened or is happening that we just don't understand. Maybe there's a step we thought we were led to take and we take it and it's a disaster. We may be busying ourselves in our life, but we're waiting upon God to understand the why.
We feel so guilty after we get it, and it was so much better than we thought, that, I have remorse. Then I look back on the ways I handled it and the ways I could have handled it better, and I feel not even worthy of that, actually, because I'm not very patient. I do have more patience than Kevin. That
Had to get that in there.
you want to trust, like he said, and then you try to handle it yourself, and then after, like I said, after it all works out, you just look back and you think there's different ways to handle that.
Yeah.
It's kind of great that you got it, but kind of sad that you couldn't handle yourself before you got it.
Do you think if we were being led by this pillar of fire, it'd be easier for us to follow God's leading?
Think.
We still wouldn't, but yeah.
The quick answer is yes, right? Yeah, show me a theophany of God and I'll follow it.
We'd still screw it up. But.
Psalm 19:1.
Stiff-necked people.
Yeah. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies proclaim the work of his hands. Guess what? Same word there, kavod. The same glory that descended upon the tabernacle, the burning bush, the temple, Ezekiel, Jesus. It's present when we step foot out of these doors and look up. What's more is we have something that Israel didn't have, right? We have the indwelling of Holy Spirit under the new covenant, as Jeremiah said. The heavens declare the weightiness of God, so that man is without excuse. But there's more to be found in the person of Jesus as well. Keep in mind our context here. God's glory is descended upon and dwelled among the people in the tabernacle. And with that in mind, I want to look at a couple of verses here. Revelation 21:22. I did not see a temple in the city because the Lord Almighty and the Lamb are its temple. Who's the temple? Jesus. Remember the words of Jesus. Also destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it again. There's no doubt he's referring to himself as temple. Colossians 1:19. For God was pleased to have his fullness dwell in him, being Jesus. So we take these verses together, God's glory, his kavod, his full presence, in addition to his temple, are brought together, they're unified in the person of Jesus the Christ. Therefore, his presence in and above the tabernacle are a foreshadowing of the Messiah who would come and dwell among his people. As John 1 puts it, the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. So that is at his command to come, we come, and at his command to go, we go. Moving when he tells us to move, trying to wait when he tells us to wait. Let's read 2 other pieces of scripture here and see what picture begins to form for us. 1 Peter 2, verses 4 and 5, it says, as you come to him, the living stone, rejected by humans but chosen by God and precious to him, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Ephesians 2:22, it says, and in him you too are being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit. So who is being built into a spiritual house, dwelling place for God?
Believers.
Jacob, are you individually being built into a spiritual house?
We as the church collectively are being built.
Yeah. It's easy for us to read this and think that me, individually, being built into a spiritual house. Jesus is the temple. In him dwells the full kavod of God. And as our cornerstone, he's building us as living stones into this spiritual house in which the Spirit of God will dwell. But in both of these verses, the you is plural. Really easy for us as Americans, as Westerners, to think in individual terms. Individuality is something that's important in our culture. We cannot escape it. It's ingrained in us. It's the way we think. But this is not about individuality. These verses are telling us we are together, the church, all of us, being built into this spiritual house. And so a question for consideration is perhaps the reason which we struggle to wait upon the Lord is because we were never meant to journey alone. And so many times the weight of our circumstances that have us in a waiting period upon God, we shoulder that individually. Individual quiet times with God, are they important? Absolutely. But maybe consider that for us to rest in God, it's done in community. Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name. But that's not what comes easy for us. We think that preparation is done for movement, don't we? We think that preparation is done for action. But in truth, there is a preparation needed for stillness. Comment? Mm-hmm. What are practical steps that we can take to prepare ourselves to wait upon the Lord.
I think that if our issue with waiting is trust, I think it's important to look back at God's providence before, and to set our minds on the fact of where God has been faithful, reminding ourselves that He has, to give us kind of a confidence in the waiting.
Look back to your standing stones. That's why it's so important for us to spend daily time in the Word and in prayer, right? Sensitivity to Holy Spirit's leading, but also being a part of a community where faith and patience are valued and practiced. And struggles are expressed openly for the support of that community. Because the culture around us makes it difficult, right? You mentioned it earlier, the very same technology that makes it easy for us to throw this on the screen and glean through so many scriptures easily is the same technology that keeps us so distracted and keeps us from being able to sit still. Constant need for immediate gratification, constant need for something new to entertain us. Very hard for us to disconnect and be still.
Well, just when we're together as a body in what we all come to think of, and it's true in part, corporate worship, that's when we have this most visible reminder of what we're doing. But again, going back to the Old Testament and where all these things we know are examples for us. I've said this a couple of times in here, but the word for worship is the same word for work. When Moses told Pharaoh, "Let my people go that we may go worship," the word was avad. That same means to go work as well. So the whole of our lives can be a waiting if we recognize that what we're doing in our daily work, our day-to-day routines, we can't all sit by the lake and fold our hands. That's what we tend to think of as waiting, but really the whole of our life is, if we understand it as worship, we are offering the same sacrifices that they did in the temple daily, minute by minute. Those are called now spiritual sacrifices. So, I try to think about this. There are moments when you get a glimpse of it that you're participating in that, but the whole of our lives are to be offering spiritual sacrifices in our work, the way we treat our wives, husbands, children, friends, neighbors. Those are spiritual sacrifices. So again, when you think about what you're bringing to us about this matter of waiting, we can wait as we do all these things.
Absolutely.
So, don't beat yourself up too bad because you're involved in work. That is
Not at all. That's why we said earlier that.
It's talking about a balance, and
Yeah.
it's all about it's worship.
Absolutely.
What we call formal worship, but really it's all worship.
If we keep that as our mindset, because that's what we said. Just like Israel stayed busy amongst the camp when they were in camp, they were still waiting. And just like we said earlier, we still busy ourselves, we still work, life goes on, but we may find ourselves in a waiting period of God to understand. You're exactly right. But if we use that busyness as an escape, that's when we lose the nature of worship.
That's the danger.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So that's part of why there is intention behind what we're trying to do as a church currently with the One Year Bible. Proverbs 19:11 says, a person, when we go back to this the intention of preparation for waiting. Proverbs 19:11 says, a person's wisdom yields patience, And Proverbs 9:10 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. When we put these together, I know it's difficult to flip back and forth here, but what these two taken together tell us is that the fear of the Lord, knowledge of the Lord, brings forth wisdom. And likewise, wisdom, when matured, brings forth patience. I love the way Abraham Heschel puts this. He says, the beginning of awe is wonder, and the beginning of wisdom is awe. Our corporate reading of Scripture is attempting to do just that, to ground us in the knowledge of the Holy One, to begin to wonder before Him. Let it bring about awe, so that we see the weightiness of His presence. We experience it in community, that as a body, as a church, we learn to come when He says come, go when He says go, wait when He says wait. And it very rarely does waiting truly look like sitting with hands folded. Are those times important in prayer? I would say absolutely. But waiting periods for God, does that mean we abandon all life and we simply sit there and say, okay, God, tell me when you're ready? Not at all. And so it comes back to what we said earlier, trust. Are we faithful to continue to pursue God even when we don't understand His means? So my prayer would be this, Psalm 27:4. It says, one thing I ask from the Lord, that this only do I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to seek Him in His temple, that we may experience kabod, that we may walk outside and see the glory of His presence, the fact that the heavens declare the glory of God, that we may remain up under His authority and in obedience, displaying patience, and remembering that there is no time lost when we're waiting upon God's timing. Easy to say, difficult to practice. Matthew Henry's commentary says, it is as acceptable a piece of submission to the will of God to sit still contentedly when our lot requires it, as it is to work for Him when we are called to it. And as we already established, those two things are not mutually exclusive. But sometimes we are called in a period of life to fully trust God in circumstances that we don't understand, that require waiting on our behalf, and acceptance, or at least acknowledgement of the fact that we may never know this side of eternal glory. Those are things that are difficult for us to accept and understand. Other thoughts as we close out the head upstairs?
I think that when we're thinking of waiting, 1,000 years is a day to the Lord. And I think the reason we have such an urgency for God for His plans to come to fruition is because as much as we say we trust, we're here like God's thinking in terms of eternity. And I think we can be really focused on this temporal existence, that we have this time here, and God is a lot more interested in our eternity with Him than He is solving some of the problems that we have here. I think that we have to remember that that's a loving God that's far more worried about 1 billion years from now than answering a prayer or giving us certainty. And I think that we have to remind ourselves that this is a God who doesn't think like we think, who has far greater plans than us. And if our suffering and waiting, or our lack of understanding brings us to heaven, what's that worth?
We use the word time as, it's one word for us, time. Time means time, but in Scripture we have kairos and we have chronos. Chronos is what we understand. The seconds tick by, the minutes tick by, the hours tick by. And so when we talk about time, we just see time as constantly going by, and we're losing it. But we understand what it means to say that now's the time to do something. That doesn't mean right this second, does it? It means the circumstances are right for this to happen. That's kairos. The seconds, the minutes, the hours might keep ticking by, but God's right timing, we understand this when Galatians tells us the fullness of time had come. That was kairos. Doesn't mean it was that. I mean, it does mean it was that hour, minute, second, but it also means all the circumstances were right for whatever reason in God's timing to bring that forth to fruition. We see time going by. We see chronos going by, times, minute, seconds, minutes, hours. But it's not the right time for God, not the right kairos, not the right circumstances. And that's what we have difficulty waiting on, because we think of time as passing by and gone and can never come back. But to God, it doesn't work that way. So may we learn to trust. May we learn to careful praying for patience. But we'll look next week at Israel's movement throughout the desert and what else we are susceptible to in the times of movement.